Macron demanded Putin agree to ceasefire proposed by Trump. Putin confident Russia to cease 4 Ukrainian regions by year's end. And something went wrong. Russia's Yars intercontinental missile launch reportedly failed. The latest news next. The President of France, Emmanuel Macron, stated that the Kremlin dictator Vladimir Putin will have to show today that he wants peace, according to a post by the French leader on the social media platform X. He said that on the evening of May 18th, he spoke with US President Donald Trump, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni after their talks in Kyiv and Tirana. Macron emphasized that Putin will have to agree to the 30-day ceasefire proposed by Trump.
Tomorrow, President Putin must show he wants peace by accepting the 30-day unconditional ceasefire proposed by President Trump and backed by Ukraine and Europe.
The United States of America and Europe will decisively strengthen sanctions against Russia if Russian dictator Vladimir Putin refuses to engage in peace negotiations with Ukraine in a spirit of goodwill, the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bassant says in an interview to CBS News. According to Bassant, US President Donald Trump made this very clear. However, at the moment, it is necessary to wait and see what happens when both sides, Ukraine and Russia, sit down at the negotiating table. At the same time, Bassant acknowledged that previous US sanctions against Russia have proven to be largely ineffective.
What I can tell you is that the sanctions were very ineffective during the Biden administration because they kept them low, because they were afraid of pushing up domestic oil prices.
However, Bassant did not specify the timeline for possible sanction expansion so as not to tie Trump's hands ahead of negotiations with Putin. After meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky in Rome, US Vice President J.D. Vance stated the shared goal of the United States and Ukraine on his X. According to Vance, Ukraine and the US have a common goal: ending unnecessary bloodshed in Ukraine. He wrote, "We discussed updates on the ongoing negotiations for a ceasefire and lasting peace." About Vance and Zelensky meeting, yesterday after the enthronement ceremony of the new Pope, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, held a meeting with US Vice President J.D. Vance and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. According to Zelensky, they discussed the negotiations in Istanbul and the importance of a ceasefire. The sides also touched upon the necessity of sanctions against Russia, bilateral trade, defense cooperation, the station on the battlefield, and the future prisoner exchange. This was the first conversation between Zelensky and Vance after the quarrel at the White House on February 28. On the night of May 19th, Russia planned to launch an RS-24 Yars intercontinental ballistic missile, but in the end something went wrong, reports Defense Express. Based on information from the Defense Intelligence of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, the launch site for the Yars was highly unusual, located in Sverdlovsk region near the settlement of Svobodny, where the 433rd Regiment of the 42nd Division of the 31st Army of Russia's Strategic Missile Forces is based. Additionally, the city of Nizhny Tagil is located about 25 kilometers from the launch site. Therefore, it is highly likely that the missile launch would have been recorded by local residents and the internet would have been filled with related photos.
Russians would also have had the opportunity to observe the missile in the air. Considering that the main Russian test range targeted by intercontinental missiles is Kura in Kamchatka, the missile's flight would have been visible across a vast territory of Siberia and the Russian Far East, from Khanty-Mansisk to Magadan.
At this point, it is unknown why the Russians did not proceed with the launch of the Yars missile. However, as noted by Andriy Kovalenko, the head of the Center for Countering Disinformation, the Russian army already experienced a failed second launch of the Oreshnik missile shortly after the first one. The head of the Kremlin, Russian terrorist Vladimir Putin, believes he has a strong hand ahead of today's conversation with US President Donald Trump, Bloomberg reports. According to a person familiar with the Russian dictator's position, Putin is confident that his troops will be able to break through Ukrainians' defenses by the end of the year and take full control of the 4 regions he declared part of Russia, referring to the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. This means that Putin is unlikely to make any significant concessions to Trump during today's conversation. For their part, European leaders are concerned that the US president may try to impose a settlement no matter what.
Trump insists on ending the war as soon as possible and has supported a direct conversation with Putin to reach a deal. The head of the Kremlin, for his part, has given no indication that he is ready to end the war. This has fueled concern in Kyiv and other European capitals that Ukraine could be forced to cede even more territory. However, at this point, it is not entirely clear whether these sentiments are real or merely the opinion of the editorial team.
Two other people close to the Kremlin claim that, despite all the talk about ending hostilities, Putin is ready for a protracted war if necessary to achieve his goals. Furthermore, he is sanguine about the prospect of further US sanctions. According to a senior European official, during a phone call on Friday, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, French President Emmanuel Macron and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer tried to make it clear to Trump that Putin is playing him. They hope Trump realizes that he risks looking like a loser if he forces Ukraine into a bad deal, the official added. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was also on Friday's call. The head of the Ukrainian state and his European allies believed that Trump had committed them to imposing new sanctions on the Kremlin if Putin refused to observe the ceasefire beginning May 12th, which never happened. Yesterday, Sunday, on the eve of today's call with Putin, Trump held a repeated call with Merz, Starmer, Macron and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. According to the British Prime Minister's press secretary, the leaders discussed the need for an unconditional ceasefire and for Putin to take negotiations seriously. Bloomberg also writes that the Kremlin had confidence in Russia's prospects on the battlefield contradicts Western assessments. According to European officials, after suffering massive losses over more than 3 years of war, Russia lacks the capabilities to achieve Putin's objectives. According to a person close to the Ministry of Defense in Moscow, many Russian military personnel fighting against Ukraine share this skepticism. In particular, the source mentioned that Ukrainian drones have made large-scale offensives costly and ineffective for Russia. The risk for Putin is that he may overestimate his capabilities and prompt Trump to carry out his threat to impose additional sanctions in order to end what the US president has called a bloodbath in Ukraine. According to European authorities familiar with the situation, American officials have privately indicated to their European counterparts that Trump is considering approving a sanctions bill prepared by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. If Russia does not make concessions, he may also tell Putin that he cannot prevent it. The Russian military and society do not support a ceasefire or an end to the war shortly. The Kremlin uses these sentiments to justify a prolonged war, according to the report from the American Institute for the Study of War, RSW. The report referred to interviews with 11 Russian soldiers conducted by the New York Times, all of whom have taken or are taking part in combat operations in Ukraine. Some of the interviewed servicemen expressed categorical opposition to a comprehensive ceasefire and believe that Russia should continue fighting until its army captures the entire territory of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. They also urge Russia to prolong the war until the territorial objectives are achieved and not to offer any concessions to Ukraine or the West.
According to them, this is necessary so that Russia does not have to fight Ukraine again in 5 or 10 years and to ensure that Russian casualties in the current war are not in vain. According to an April survey conducted by the independent Russian opposition sociological organization Chronicles, about half of the respondents opposed a peace agreement that would not meet Vladimir Putin's initial aims of denazification, demilitarization, and neutrality of Ukraine.
The report also cited results from an April 2025 survey of 100 Russian military personnel conducted by the opposition publication Verska. According to the results, only 18% of respondents supported the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine before achieving the war goals declared by terrorist Putin, and only about 1/5 believed the war will end in the coming month. The ISW noted that these survey results indicate the Kremlin has not prepared the Russian information space for a peace agreement soon, and that the Russian military and society do not expect the war to end shortly. Analysts believe the Kremlin is making deliberate efforts to justify Putin's war aims as vital for the Russian state and is securing public support to prolong the war until Russia achieves these goals.
Kremlin officials are increasingly publicly stating that Russia is prepared to continue fighting until Ukraine accepts Russia's demands. Likely because the Kremlin assesses that it has adequately prepared Russian society and the Russian military for such a scenario.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching this video. Like and subscribe.